Hi, good morning everyone. I'm Elias, one of the organizers. It's a great pleasure to have you all here in this beautiful resort in the great town of Chania. I just wanted to start by saying a few things about our initiative, who we are, what our goals are, what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. So just to kind of give you sort of an idea of how this whole thing started. I mean, basically this is an essentially academic initiative. It's interdisciplinary. I mean, our core group, and I'm going to introduce everyone, consists both of political scientists, lawyers, and some economists. And in a sense, it's a purely political initiative, right? But in the more authentic sense of the word. We have no party affiliation whatsoever. We're completely non-partisan, but we really care about what's going on both in Greece and in Europe in terms of policy. So we are, in that sense, we are very much motivated by sort of the broader socioeconomic environment, the ongoing crisis, in both at the level of policies, at the level of state organization, at the social level. You know, in all of the sort of the facets and the repercussions of the evolving crisis. Our emphasis, and as you can see from the title of our group, is on policy. And we are actually quite keen on emphasizing the distinction between policy and politics. And actually it's quite characteristic that in the Greek language there is no such distinction. Right? And in Greek we talk about politiki, both in terms of policy and politics. I think that's quite telling of how policy is made in this country and possibly in others. Let me just kind of go around and introduce sort of the organizers and the key people of this initiative. Let me start by Dr. Elias Dinas. He's an associate professor of politics at the University of Oxford. Dr. Adrienne. He's a lecturer in international law, in European law, University of Nottingham. Mr. Kyriakos Papadakis, our kind host, which I would very much like to thank for his very kind hospitality. Without him, this wouldn't have been possible by any means. And he's also involved in He's part of Dissident Consultants Initiative, and he's also affiliated to the Center for Commercial Law and Financial Regulation at Queen Mary. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Vasilis Develekos, lecturer in Public International Law, right? The University of Hull Law School. So, kind of to be a bit more concrete and more specific about what we're trying to achieve here. First of all, we are trying to basically to enrich and foster a more sort of evidence-based sort of dialogue, discourse, both on policy issues and public affairs within Greece, but also Greece within Europe, right? Within a wider setting. We are very much interested in sort of the current sort of reform agenda taking place in Greece. So we are trying both to monitor and criticize the reforms that are being implemented at the moment. From a research point of view, we are trying to promote more of an interdisciplinary kind of perspective, and the fact that our group consists both of all types of social scientists actually attests to that. The fact that you're all here also means that we're trying to consolidate a wider international network of experts in various policy areas, and I mean, obviously we're not really, as you can see, we're interested both in what both Greeks and non-Greeks have to say about the situation. But our actual motivation was that we are trying to tap in on a very, on a sort of a wide network of very skilled professionals and academics who have an interest or an affiliation or even Greek nationality, and people who care about what's going on here. We're trying to frame the crisis in Greece and also elsewhere, right, in other from a comparative point of view in other sort of Southern European countries within a wider European perspective. So actually the focus of today's events is going to be mostly on the European aspect. Tomorrow we're going to kind of focus a bit more, we're going to zero in on the Greek situation. And finally, we also try to establish sort of links with other similar initiatives in Greece and Europe. I mean, as you know, that the crisis has sort of spearheaded a number of such initiatives in various countries, and we are trying to establish sort of linkages and to sort of bridge over with those initiatives. Our tools, how we're trying to do this. First of all, by organizing public events like this one and roundtables. And Ali's actually going to talk about, going to go into more detail about the kind of events that we've organized so far. We're trying to sort of make use of the full range of social media tools. So we are actually actively we're running a blog. We try to be as active in terms of possible, in terms of writing op-eds and articles in Greek and other newspapers. We are running some online polls. But also in terms of, from a research perspective, we actually, we already run an expert survey on constitutional reform, something that Elias is going to talk about in more detail. We have a very sort of active presence in the social media. You can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, something that I would like to emphasize. And actually, I would like to also encourage you, those of you who are more active on Twitter, to post some comments and to sort of write about our discussions today and tomorrow. And I'm going to provide more details. You're going to find the details on the freezer page, both our Twitter sort of account and the hashtag for this event. The website, you can find us on the web. It's quite long, but I'm sure you'll find it. And in terms of funding, I mean, we're quite sort of aware of this sort of need for transparency, and that's something we really sort of emphasize. So there's a separate section on the website, sort of clearly outlining our funding sources. So I think I'm going to pass it over to Alice, who is going to sort of take us through the different events that we've organized since 2011, when our group came together, and then I'm going to...
Should I come there, or...? Oh, it's fine. I can see it from here. So, first of all, a warm welcome from me as well to the lovely Gianni Beach Resort. We'll very quickly go through some of the events that we have organized since 2011, when we first started. Our first event was at Oxford University, at Nuffield College, where it was, as you can see, quite often, obviously, the titles somehow are linked with the temporary, the period, the time and the political developments of that time. So very soon after the start of the Greek crisis, we tried to identify various sort of streams where, and try to elaborate, yes, I think, yes, the crisis has emerged. So it was, again, from the very beginning, our attempt was interdisciplinary. And the first event also was an opportunity to map around the available interest in this initiative, and as you can understand, the interest was quite strong. Then in Nottingham, our second event, was soon after that was in 2012, soon after the change, both in Italy and in Greece, of the governments. We had the Monti, obviously, and the Papadimos governments in Greece, and the focus of our discussion there was to what extent our standard or known forms of governance at national level was up to scratch in order to respond, or to be able to respond to quick changes in the financial and the market world. whether there were any limits, and if there were any limits, whether we were happy with the fact that what seemed to be as put forward as a solution was this sort of top-down putting in place of expert, perhaps much more competent governments of technocrats. Yes? Then at the LSE, we organized an event that again looked at the crisis, but also tried to elaborate on future solutions. In Strasbourg, we changed a little bit the focus on something that was really obviously and still is very, very important, and that's the rise of extremism in Europe. And we had the opportunity to organize this event at the European Parliament in Strasbourg, with the participation mainly of political scientists, but not only. Then a few days ago, we presented in Greece, together with, in collaboration with the political community Forward Greece, our experts survey, or preliminary results of our expert survey on the constitutional reform in Greece, and Elias will have the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more further on. And we have what we call our annual flagship event. This is the third one. This is the Chania Forum. We try to follow a natural sort of to link each year the discussions with that of the previous year. So we started with an interdisciplinary discussion, and I think through a comparative lens of what seems to be a dichotomy between the European North, or the core, and the South. And in the South, of course, we included Ireland as well, although it's quite up north geographically speaking. And last year, we, whilst continuing on that multidisciplinary approach and trend, we wanted to elaborate a little bit more, look at the various layers of governance, how they interrelate to each other, and what's, because of course it was a pre-election year for the EU and some of the member states, and we wanted to contemplate how perhaps the new geography of the Union could be after the elections, and what changes in substance may occur. So this links very nicely with this year's event, which is obviously, we know the results of the election, we know the new political geography of the European Parliament. Not only that, we know the road up to the election that seemingly, or that was at least the argument, has been very different from previous elections, European elections. And try to integrate or to infuse a little bit in the process a much more political, or if you want, ideologically, and that was the attempt at least, part in the debates. As a result, we see, and this is one of the ideas and the aims of this conference, is to contemplate how this ideological polarization that now even we see it present at European Union level, how that may play out for the Union and the integration process in the context of what we see as an emerging trend of secessionist, I use entre guillemets the term, secessionist tendencies in various countries. We put there Scotland, although we will see to what extent that was a secessionist in the purest sense movement or not, but there are clearly other tendencies in other member states to go down that route. And of course, last but not least, we have the recent very important development with the establishment of banking union in the European Union that raises a number of very interesting procedural, legal, and political questions that we'll need to discuss and tackle. Yes? Last, we don't have any. Before I give the floor to Elias to present very briefly some of the results of our expert survey of constitutional reform, I would like to thank, I think this is absolutely important and necessary, our sponsors of the event. Of course, Kyriakos Papadakis is not only a sponsor, he's an active member of the group, but as we have seen here, he is the host. And of course, we would like to thank Kyriakos personally, the Zidenti consultants, and the Kiani Beach team, particularly Peli, who's not here, Peli Kalamiotakis, whom I think you know all very, very well, and you will find the opportunity to find out more about Peli the next 2 days. Also, Kalpak and Europe Direct for their kind sponsorship. We would like also to thank the Chamber of Commerce of Greece, the Department of Western Crete for their kind support in more than one ways. And I would like to pass the floor to Elias Dinas to present us with some of the preliminary results of the expert survey. I hope you have an enjoyable and useful 2 days here.
Right, thank you very much, Aris. Thank you very much for being here as well. I'm not going to bother you for more than 2 or 3 minutes. I'm just going to present you very quickly a couple of results that we got from an expert survey that we ran with respect to the constitutional reform. Well, having that in mind, we designed a questionnaire that was quite long and included many more aspects of political regimes, such as the liberal system, sometimes issues or aspects that, of course, are not included in the Constitution. Anyway, and it was mainly an expert survey in the sense that we tried to. It was an expert survey, but on the other hand, our experts weren't that experts unnecessarily in the sense that we didn't only refer to academics of constitutional law or not even to law academics in general. We also included political scientists and the economists. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time just to say that we did organize that event with Brosta, which is a very important kind of group of people in Greece for typical kind of how do you call it? Civil society, exactly. And Panagiotis is a member and an active member of them, and he's here with us. So we did organize that in Athens. I'm going to very quickly just show you some things related to the results. I guess it's... Right. So I'll just 3 slides very briefly. So one of the questions was what type of regime do you want to have in case we have a constitutional reform. For those of you who might not be familiar with the exact form of government in Greece, Greece is a parliamentary democracy. There is some discussion about whether the president as head of state should be directly elected or not. People don't understand that this means directly, of course, that there's a change in the regime, that this has to be, that can only happen as a result of the constitutional reform. It was interesting that among the experts, we did ask our experts 2 things. First of all, whether they would be willing to consider a directly elected head of state, and whether this should be accompanied by increasing competencies. And it is quite interesting that I'm sorry that it's not very clear what you can see here and what you cannot see. This is the status quo. The first column is the status quo. The second column is simply, and this is the black color is people, the percentage of people who agree with this, its combination of competencies and either direct or indirect way of electing. The president of the status quo is indirectly elected with few competencies, and that is the one that seems to be more kind of popular. However, it is interesting that there is some support for directly elected presidents, and especially interestingly, without that necessarily being coupled by increasing their competencies, which again is a bit of an oxymoron, but I think most people don't really understand, at least in the way that the discussion is taking place in Greece. And it's quite interesting that there were also, even among the experts, quite a considerable number of people suggesting an increase of competencies without changing the way of election. So indirectly elected president, head of state, with more competencies, which of course would be a change from a status quo, but towards a less kind of democratic direction than the one that is being discussed. Now, very quickly, if Greece does not have a constitutional court, and among there's been again a discussion about whether this is needed or not. Among the experts, having a constitutional court seems to be a good solution. So the dark blue here is a yes, in the question of whether there should be a constitutional court. And I just want to say something very quickly to talk about the electoral system. We also asked some questions about the electoral systems. Why did we do that? Well, it's quite obvious that Greece is not exactly a very typical example of a country that has established democracy in this respect. In the last 40 years after the transition to democracy, there have been, I think, 15 different electoral systems. And there is, of course, a discussion now about the current electoral system designed to secure majorities in what would be or used to be a two-party system with approximately 40% of the first party. Now we don't live in this age anymore, we don't live in this era. So there are concerns about the extent to which the bonus that is given to the first party should be retained or not. So we did ask whether there should be, we asked things regarding the ballot and the district magnitude. So we kind of presented two ideal cases: Netherlands, one country, one constituency, versus the UK with the first past the post system. There seems to be a clear preference for a more kind of a British system. And I think the reason for that is because of the fact that there is also a need, according to the experts at least, for more direct accountability between members of the parliament and members of the constituency and the voters. Interestingly, I just want to share this with you. I don't know if it has been heard or has been discussed outside Greece, but Greece changed the electoral system also before the European election, the election for the European Parliament, and it did so in a way that is, if anything, at least interesting. It is an example that we used to have. And I see now an example that we used to have of things that you shouldn't be doing to students in Oxford in a kind of a simulation of countries and how the electoral system should be built according to the situation of the countries. So what happened was that there is one country, one constituency with preference votes. So people having to find out among, you can imagine how many alternatives, 50 or 20 or 40 throughout the country to get preferences. Of course, the problem of that is that it is impossible for the candidates to campaign throughout the whole country. So you end up having, of course, a kind of bias in favor of people who are more generally popular or famous already on TV. Anyway, so we did ask whether they think it would be better to have a list or a preference vote, and I think there is a very clear preference for preference vote. And there is more about the constitution in our website and about the project, and of course I would be more than happy to give more information about this if needed. Thank you.
Yeah, so before we get started, I'd like to make a few announcements. First of all, just want to point out that there is uninterrupted Wi-Fi access here, and I trust you have all found your login details. Let me point out, so that this is the sort of the freezer pane. So our Twitter account is GPPF, and the hashtag for this event is Chania Forum 2014. So to those of you who are more active on Twitter, we really do encourage you to tweet about us because we really want to boost our visibility and our exposure to the social media and people who use it. Let me say a few more things. So for those of you who are interested in visiting the town of Chania, there's going to be there's a bus scheduled to leave today at 9 p.m. Right? So it's entirely optional if you want to go for a walk. We're going to have dinner right before. You are welcome to skip dinner and have dinner in town, but I think most of us are going to have dinner here. you're going to go out for a drink. And there's going to be a bus tomorrow as well, leaving at 7 p.m., where we have already scheduled dinner at one of the nice portside tavernas. And we would actually like you to sign up for it so we have some idea of the number of people who are coming. So you can do all that at the reception. You can ask for Fernando. One more thing, again, in the spirit of sort of getting the most out of our meeting here and also boosting visibility, we're going to ask you to do very short 2 to 3 minute interviews right after your panel. The way it goes, Elias is going to give you, Elias and Vasilis actually, they're going to give you 1 or 2 questions that we're going to ask you to answer in front of the camera, and then we're going to sort of post the video on our website and on our Facebook page and so on. And from our experience so far, these have been very popular, very successful, because they're kind of very short, very pithy kind of sound bites of what the conference is about and what sort of your position is on some very important issues. Let me say again that this is optional, but we would really like it if you did it. So please come up to Elias right at the end of your panel, and we're going to set up a camera right over there so you can do the interview. Again, in the same spirit, we would also like to encourage you to submit any kind of blog pieces you may have, any OPED. Some of you, and actually most of you, have already sent us your abstracts, which are perfectly fine. We're gonna post those on the website. But if you have something a bit more extended, more detailed, we would really like if you would share with us so we can upload it on our website. And finally, let me just point out again that our meeting is being recorded. So everything is on camera. The plan is to sort of to post again, to post the full video of the meeting on our website. So I think there. Anything else? Okay, so let our discussions begin. I think we can start with our first panel. I think Elias is the chair of the first panel. So if you just want to introduce the speakers and what do you need to get?
I'm not sure it's meant to be formal.
I think everyone gets the idea. This is meant to be very informal and non-academic.
So the first session is going to be about the title is an even closer union in the midst of ideological polarization, democratic and institutional implications of the European elections. So this is a panel about the European elections and the aftermath. And the speakers will be Adrienne Héritier from the European University Institute, Irene Martín from the Autonomous University of Madrid, and Fernando Mendez, who is a lecturer in the University of Zurich and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and Abdul Nouri, who is an associate professor of political science at the YU.
I did not make
He didn't, yeah, of course he didn't make it. So he was the first three. So Adrienne, if you want to start first.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about actually to the topic from the viewpoint of this forum on the emerging institutional design of the European Union at the supranational level as a reaction to the economic financial crisis and the parliamentary elections. And I would like to point out 3 developments which I find quite striking, which have emerged in the last couple of years, in the last months, which point into the direction of more of a parliamentarization of the political system of the European Union, in the sense of that a European government is elected by a European Parliament, which is responsible to this Parliament and democratically legitimated by this Parliament. And that is a strong interconnection between the legislative and the executive. Now, of course, Europe is different from a classical parliamentary system in the sense that there is also another legislator besides the European Parliament, which is the Council of Ministers, of course, and the executive, as you speak, Commission, is also responsible to the Council of Ministers. But what we can observe now in these last months and years is an increasing competition between these two legislators as regards the power in determining who is actually in this government or executive, speak commission, and who is this executive responsible to, and what should it be conceptualized, how should it be conceptualized. Now, I would like to, as I said, point out three developments which I find quite striking, which point to a more of a parliamentarization of the European political system. And the first of these developments is, as you all know, the strategy of the European Parliament in a way to a further step in electing the head of the Commission, the famous Spitzenkandidat strategy, where, given the ambiguous and ambivalent institutional rules of the Lisbon Treaty as to how to nominate and how to elect the President of the Commission, the Parliament, in a very genius move, strategic move, has in a way forced the hand of the European Council in stating, as you all know, that the candidate who comes out as the majority candidate from the EP elections will, by definition, be the candidate for the presidency of the Commission. Although the treaty actually says that the Council, the European Council, should come up with a proposal for the presidency of the Commission. And it will be very interesting to see, so in a way, the right of the European Council was preempted by this move of the European Parliament in the competition of these two institutions to define the head of the Commission, or to which then obviously needs to be confirmed by the majority of the Parliament. Now the question will be, and it will be interesting to see whether, whether this is going to be formalized or not in the next round. And I think it will be very difficult not to use this type of form of proposal of a candidate for the Commission presidency after 2014, but whether it will actually be formalized as an element of the further treaty revision remains to be seen. So that's the first development, which in a way points into the direction of an election of a government by the European Parliament. And now the second development, which I find quite striking to see, this Commission as such trying to transform itself from an executive, or as some of the German commentators have said, of a Behörde, an authority actually, not a government, to form and transform itself into indeed a government of Europe. And if you look at now the most recent initiatives and plans and steps taken by Juncker, clearly work into that direction of restructuring the Commission in a quite incisive way, coming up with a political program which should be implemented in these coming years of the Commission presidency. And not so much the Commission being in a way the honest broker mediating between the interests of the individual member states, but having a program, political program of its own, and this political program being implemented by, as you have probably seen in the last days, what has been described in the press, restructuring the work of the Commission, having, re-evaluating and enhancing the role of the vice presidents of the Commission in order to implement this program. It's true that member states have proposed, and so far we will see after the hearings of the European Parliament upcoming now in the next 10 days, whether they will come through. But basically, the member states have proposed their commissioner candidates and have gotten the commissioners, at least as proposals by Juncker, pretty much what they wanted. But what is different now is that these commissioners are in a way subject and under the tutelage of the vice presidents. The vice presidents, which are to coordinate the work of these commissioners, which means that these vice presidents are the ones who are meant to translate the political program of the commission presidency into a policy program, into practical policies. And they do so by being, in a way, gatekeepers of what the individual DGs propose as policy initiatives. They only can go through if the vice president responsible or the coordinator of this particular commissioner okays these initiatives and says, yes, it can go on to the collection. Only then will it be discussed as a possible policy initiative of the commission. And the 7 vice presidents also will have access to the resources of the DGs in a way they are to coordinate in view of their particular political project. So each vice president in a way has a political project and is to implement this political project with the resources of the DGs which are under its coordination. So to give you an example, for instance, Mogherini, the Vice President and High Representative, has the project of a stronger global actor of the European Union. So she coordinates the work of Neighborhood and Enlargement Commissioner, of Trade, of International Development, of Human Aid and Crisis Management. Interestingly also, as you may have read in the press, Mogherini is will not be located in the External Action Services, as it used to be as her predecessor used to do, but she will be in the Commission. She will be located in the Commission and will be directly talking to the Commission President anymore. And again, you can see here clearly that in foreign policy, Juncker is trying to have much more of a clout over the External Action Services as well, European External Action Services, incorporating more into the Commission because the EEAS, the European External Action Services, in a way are as much also subject under the authority of member states of the European Council. So again, you have this competition between the two institutions as to how it can prevail in shaping the policies. So this is one example of how the project of a vice president has access and clout and command all resources of individual DGs. Or another really interesting example is, of course, to see economic policy, financial policy, Eurozone policy, who's playing which role where, and as you know, Moscovici has been proposed for economic affairs, and Hill has been proposed for financial services, which are very, very different profiles, obviously, in terms of policy stances, but they will be subordinate to or coordinated by Katainen, who is the vice president responsible for jobs, growth, investment and competitiveness of Europe. So in a way what you see is an emerging containing of the power of the DGs by the vice presidents being kind of the gatekeepers to what gets to the Commission presidency, but in a very close dialogue always with the President of the Commission, with his political program, policy program. So we have a new system of power and counter-power in the Commission, and it will be very interesting to see how it's going to play out in reality. Now what about the Parliament in this picture? We already talked about the Parliament and forcing its hand and gaining more of a role in determining and defining who the candidate should be for the presidency of the Commission, and successfully so, as we know. But beyond that, of course, we have now the question of, given the ideological polarization the increasing anti-Europe kind of mood in many states, in many member states, and the emerging parties in Sweden, in Germany, in Italy, against Europe. So how does the Parliament react to this development? And what is interesting to see is that the two big groups, the Socialists, the Democrats, and the EPP have gotten together de facto into a grand coalition. And they will plan to work together very closely in order to support, again, what? The program, actually, of the Commission presidency to implement and to realize this program. And the reaction, of course, against the background of the increasing ideological polarization is very understandable, because as we talk about these entire questions of the new economic governance in Europe and the talk about the strict application of the Stability and Growth Pact, which in a way, as one commentator has very rightly said, lights domestic fire of political conflicts, not only in Italy, in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain. And the question is, how do you deal with these very, very important to expected political conflicts in the actual application and the implementation of the European semester? And I'm always very surprised in a way to see how the Commission and the ECB and the IMF expect in a way to have the 3% rule being imposed in order to be implemented in member states. And in a way, as a political scientist, it strikes you as something very strange, because you only can impose things actually in a dictatorship. But in a normal democracy, you can say, okay, you would have to observe the 3% rule, but how you do it, how and where you cut your money, how you increase or cut your taxes, that has to go through a political process, a democratic political process, and you don't really know what the outcome exactly will be of this democratic political process. So what is very striking to see that on the one hand, the technocrats, which are saying IMF and ECB also, maybe less the Commission, they just think that will happen automatically, and it doesn't. It doesn't. There will be, as this commentator put it, it may be really lead to huge domestic political conflicts. So what I want to say, what we see as a change, overall change in the polity as regards the Parliament, is that this grand coalition forming in the Parliament in view of these anti-European kind of trends, kind of forming together and trying to support, as it were, this new Commission government. But I also have to mention, and then I will stop, of course, the Parliament, which is upcoming now, the Parliament also has the right now of the hearings. Actually, the right of the hearings of the Commission, the DG commissioners, is something that the Parliament hasn't been written down anywhere. The Parliament just started doing that, and by starting to introduce these hearings, in a way it is established a right of rejecting or confirming an individual commissioner, and as it only has the full right of confirming the entire commission, as we know. So, but it has very successfully in kind of interpreting this rule, unclear rule in the Lisbon Treaty and the past treaties indeed, in order to give itself a right of individual confirmation of each individual commissioner. And that's something which goes in way beyond classical parliamentary democracy, because in very few parliamentary democracies do you have the right of the Parliament to confirm individual ministers of this government. It's actually quite rare. In Hamburg, in the constitution of the Hansestadt Hamburg, you get it. So the Parliament is in the process of doing that, but what actually you see it will be interesting also to see whether Parliament, it will of course try to assert itself again, and as it did in the past, for instance with Rocco Buttiglione, rejected this proposal, asked for a commissioner, and it would love to reject at least one or two, just for institutional reasons, to put down its foot and say we are a player in this game. But in view of the need of having this grand coalition in the Parliament, it won't be that easy, so they probably will go for the small kind of commissioners which are proposed by ALDE or by the Conservatives, which means Hill actually. So it will be very interesting to see how they will behave now in the next 10 days when the hearings will take place. To conclude, I think what we see in a way is a change in architecture of the European polity, and I think indeed that we have a step into a more kind of parliamentarization, and the Commission being more of a type of a government with a program supported by a parliament. And the structure within the Commission having, in a way, these vice presidents as real ministers, and the commissioners being actually secretaries of state type of actors. So I think indeed we see some emergence of type of European government. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. And now we'll go to the more kind of mobilization aspect from Spain and Madrid.
Good morning. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, first of all, I would also like to thank very much the organizers for inviting me for the second time to these meetings. I was present during the first meeting in Oxford, and I'm really happy to be here a bit more than 2 years later. I'm going to tell you a bit about the ideological polarization side of this panel, and more specifically I will tell you about this new political party that appeared in the last European elections in Spain, called Podemos, We Can. And Elias asked me to somehow make a comparison with Syriza, and because it has been compared to Syriza with, yeah, I know. This is one of the things I want to address, to see to what extent it is comparable, to what extent it is not. So that's why the title of my intervention is going to be Podemos and Syriza, the same phenomenon, because in some way it is, in some things it is, in some things it is not. And it's also interesting to know how they perceive each other, or how they want to tell people that they perceive each other, in the sense that even if they may not be alike, it may be their interest to present themselves as something alike. And I think that is more specifically what is going on. So before I tell you about this party, I want to place it in context. I think it's also interesting to see what is happening both in Spain and Greece in electoral terms, because only in that sense, only that in that way can one understand which is the context in which this party appeared. I don't know how well you can see these graphs. This is just a comparison of the electoral results of the three last European elections in Spain and in Greece. And basically what this shows is that there is a political party system crisis in both countries. It's more accentuated in the case of Greece, which is the second graph. You can easily see, I don't know how to point in the graph, but anyway, the green line shows how PASOK went from 36.65 to 8.8% votes in the last European elections. In the case of Spain, the decline of the Socialist Party is not that big. It went from 39% to 23%. It is big as well. I mean, it's only when you compare it to Greece that it doesn't look that big, but it is huge as well. And it's accompanied by the crisis of the center-right party as well, just like in Greece. In Greece, it looks like the center-right party is not in crisis because PASOK is more in crisis, but they are both. So in that sense, that phenomenon, that context is rather similar, although the intensity in Greece as what regards PASOK is a lot bigger. And this is the context in which Syriza went up. Here I'm only showing results from the European elections. I will show you now from results from surveys on vote intention for general elections so that we can see how this happened between 2009 and 2014. But in any case, here you see the huge difference in electoral results in European elections. In the case of Spain, the only thing you can see in this graph is that small parties were capitalizing the losses of the bigger parties. It's not as steep the rise of these new, well, they are not new, they are new in their role in the political party system, but for example, United Left went from not even 4% to 10%. This 10% is a lot less than they expected and than the surveys were saying they would get 1-2 months before the European elections. According to some surveys, United Left was expected to get 15% in the European elections. Why didn't they get it? Because Podemos, this new party, appeared. They were founded so that you can... I don't know how much you know about the party, but it was founded at the beginning of March this year. In 3 months, they got 8% in the European elections and 5 members of the European Parliament. Is this something that is like a fashion that will disappear, especially because it has happened in the context of European elections, which are second-order elections, and that may make them look as some elections in which voters can afford to vote for a funny party, a colorful party, and then disappear, and then not support it anymore. It doesn't look like that's the case, and that's why I wanted to show you, well, I'm going to skip some graphs. I have them here just in case you have questions about the more general context. But I'm going straight to this graph in which you can see which is the vote intention in the last CIS, the Center for Sociological Research, which does the best surveys, well, some of the best surveys in Spain, quite reliable ones. And vote intention for Podemos in the last survey in July is 17.6% estimated. Direct vote is around 13%. So it seems like they are here to stay at least for a while. And it's not only this, it's that in Spain, everybody talks about Podemos all the time. I think some people here can confirm that it's become an obsession, and that it's not only people that talk about it, but it's also the rest of the political parties that are reacting against it. And not only reacting against it, but also imitating their strategy, which is even more interesting. So after a first period in which they were criticizing the party and the leader absolutely every day for everything they have done in the last months and also in the past, they have been criticizing them for what they have done during the past years. For example, their involvement with the government of Venezuela. That has been one of the most often heard criticisms. But now, after they have realized that talking so bad about them is publicity for the party, is making them become more popular, they have started imitating them. For example, the recently elected leader of the Socialist Party, Pedro Sánchez, he's starting to call, well, this is just one example, but it's quite expressive, I think. It's quite characteristic of the phenomenon. Is starting to call these programs on television that are very popular in order to make himself better known. This has been the strategy that Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, has followed, and this is what has helped him become so well known in such a short time. So now it's the strategy of imitation, like I said. And Syriza is getting 30% according to one of the latest surveys by MRB. So it's not comparable still in terms of the support they are getting, but as we see, Podemos is going fast, just as fast as Syriza went. If you see here, until spring-autumn 2011, Syriza was not getting more than 10%. It was below 10%. So it was in between the autumn of 2011 and May 2012 that it went from 10 to 16%, and then between May and June that it went from 16% to 26%. So in that sense, it is, I mean, when I say comparable, please don't take me very literally, but one cannot say that because it's such a recent phenomenon, that of Podemos, it is not comparable, because the phenomenon of Syriza's support is also quite recent in that sense. Of course, the history of the two parties is very different. I don't need to say that, I mean, most of you know a lot more about Syriza than me here. It's a very old party, linked until 1968 to the Communist Party, a Euro-Communist Party in Spain. We have the equivalent would be, or a Euro-Communist Party until the end of the 80s. In Spain, the equivalent to Syriza would be United Left.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and still it is not exactly the equivalent, because there is no equivalent to PQE. The Communist Party in Spain is within United Left. But nowadays that Podemos has appeared, we could, in terms of party competition, we could say that United Left is playing the role of PQE here of the Communist Party here in Greece. I mean, it's the competitor to the left of Podemos. And Podemos is taking support from United Left, just like Syriza is taking support from PQE, amongst others. So, I mean, I'm forcing comparison a bit, but just so that you understand the context. Another thing that is not similar is that in the political space of the center-left, there is no other competition in Spain. I mean, there is one rather small party called Union Progress and Democracy, but they are not clearly center-left. They are center. I mean, the leader comes from the Socialist Party, but they are considered more center than center-left. So in that sense, there is no equivalent to Dinas. That's what I mean. So the competition in the left is different if it makes sense to talk about Dinas anymore, which maybe it doesn't. Okay. So just so you get an idea, some numbers so that you can compare the two parties, where they are getting electoral support from, which are the old parties that they are getting, the voters of all parties that they are getting their support from now. So in the case of Podemos, when we ask people if there were elections tomorrow, which party would you vote for? Those who say they would vote for Podemos are coming mainly from United Left. In the second place, they are coming from the Socialist Party and from this small party I was telling you about, this UPRD. But mainly from United Left. So that is the party that is being most threatened by Podemos. In the case of Syriza, it's basically the same political space, ideological space, but it's broader in the sense that they are also getting from independent Greeks in this memorandum, anti-memorandum, new cleavage, which in Spain does not exist. So that's what explains why here there is support coming from the right as well, while in Spain that's not exactly the case yet. After the European elections, okay, would you mind telling me when to stop, because I didn't look at the time when I started.
Okay,
after the European elections, there was a lot of talk saying that those who were supporting Podemos were only young people, or mainly young people. If we look at these other more recent data that refer to possible future elections, what we see is that there is not such age cleavage. I mean, it's not only the young people that say they would vote for Podemos. It goes from 18 to 54. Just like in the case of Syriza, older people are not willing to vote for them, but it's quite well distributed amongst the rest. So in this sense, there is a point for comparison, because both parties attempt to reach all age groups in society. They don't have a discourse that appeals only to young people. In terms of education, the vote of Podemos compared to that of Syriza is more concentrated in those with higher level of education. But just like in the case of age, it is very likely that this starts changing. I mean, as it becomes more popular, its aim is to reach all different social groups. They do not, and this is something I want to make very clear, they do not want to appeal to a certain social group. They do not want to. And this is one of the biggest differences with Syriza, not because Syriza does not aim to reach as big as an electorate as possible, but because Syriza still has a strong ideological discourse around the idea of the left. Podemos does not want to have a discourse in ideological terms, in old ideological terms. Their discourse is around this idea of the parties of, I think it's pronounced the caste, like in India, how do you pronounce it? The caste? Anyway, I mean, this is a new polarization in Spain. This new party against all old parties. In the Spanish context, Syriza would be part of the caste. That's why I say, I mean, they say they are similar to each other, and this is something that talking to members of Podemos, they will tell you, we are just like Syriza. We have the same discourse. It's true they have the same program, the same electoral program, but, shall I stop?
Do they like each other?
Do they like each other? Yes, yes. I mean, very much. That's what I was trying to convey. That they, I mean, there have been delegations of Podemos that have visited Syriza several times in Athens, and I have some declarations on the part of Syriza saying that it's very good to have new people, new ideas. This is something interesting. They do not, in their support of Podemos, they do not say we are ideological brothers. It's new people, new ideas. Because in fact, Podemos does not want to have the same discourse as Syriza. They want to assimilate to Syriza in their electoral success. And because also the members that founded Podemos, they all come from the left. They used to be members of United Left, but they don't want to use the left word in their discourse. On the contrary, and maybe, I mean, even though they get support from the left, okay? Because they say, they don't deny they are leftists. I mean, their past somehow betrays them in a way. But here, for example, you see that Syriza is getting a lot more support from the left. It's more clearly to the left compared to Podemos. Podemos also gets more support from the left, but the difference with other positions in the ideological spectrum is not as huge as in Syriza. In Syriza, it's huge, and I would say that the tendency in Podemos is to move towards the center of the political spectrum. Just not to make my intervention too big, let me just read a couple of declarations so that you get this idea regarding the ideology.
May I ask something very quickly?
Yeah.
Which party group did they join in the European
Same
Parliament?
citizen. They are the left group. Yeah. But for example, some declarations by Pablo Iglesias, who is the leader of Podemos, who by the way has the same name as the founder of the Socialist Party.
Say about the ballot. About the photo.
Yeah, let me explain that now. I'm going to say a few words about the ideology and a few words about the organization, and I can comment on the picture in the ballot when talking about the organization, and I finish. Just so that you get an idea of this discourse that I was telling about. They say the unity of the people, popular unity, is a lot more important than the unity of the left. Or there are many people that are left out of the traditional core discourse of the left. Or as long as the left keeps thinking that what defines us politically are ideological tags, that is our signs of identity, there will always be a roof to us. Or our language needs to appeal to the social majority. It's this idea of the social majority, popular unity, popular majority. There is room for everybody in the social majority. We are not going to ask anybody who they vote for. I mean, I think it's clear that they do not deny, they refer to the left, they do not deny that they come from the left, but they want to go beyond, and they reject the idea of politics as something ideological. And this is something that I have been told in interviews directly. They even define themselves as populists. They define themselves as populists. And they refer to populism in Latin America as one of the main sources of social change. So they are even accepting this discourse. It's not something that people use to criticize them only. Of course, they are being criticized as being populists, but they are somehow proud. I mean, proud. They want to be populists. And the other thing I wanted to say is about the organization. Compared to Syriza, I mean, of course, Syriza has an old organization in a way, and also an organization that has changed after Synaspismo joined together with other groups and became Syriza. And I think this is one of the things they need to solve: internal unity and this, whether they are going to keep recognizing each of the different groups in terms of internal organization or not. But probably you can tell me more about that. In any case, what Podemos is doing in terms of organization is, on the one hand, they are emphasizing very, very much direct democracy. And this is something that we could already see when comparing the indignant movements in Spain and in Greece. In Spain, there was a lot more emphasis on political change at the beginning than on economic change. In fact, the first 4 points that were agreed amongst the different assemblies in Spain were strictly political. They were not economical. It was a lot easier to find consensus about increasing transparency, increasing proportionality in the electoral system, or increasing direct democracy than about the economic model that we should look for, or economic measures. In the case of Syriza, the discourse and electoral programs are more centered in the economy. It can also be explained because of the gravity of the crisis in Greece. It's normal, but this is something that in Spain, that the political regeneration is very much, a lot more present in general than in Greece, and that's why it is also reflected in the discourse of Podemos and on the emphasis they are putting on their internal organization. So what is it that they are doing? The basis of their proto-organization is different circles in different cities of Spain, just like the assemblies during the indignant movement. They do not coincide always. That is, in some cities where the assemblies of the indignant movement were very strong, you cannot find circles of Podemos and vice versa. So it's not totally coincident. Well, we can talk about that later, but in any case, just so that you get an idea of how important direct democracy is for them. But at the same time, the leader is playing a crucial role. And the moment they realized that 60% of the Spanish population knew who Pablo Iglesias was right before the European elections, they decided to put his picture on the electoral ballot. That's what Elias was saying. Well, they say that they think at least one MP is due to that. Because nobody anticipated that they would get 5 MPs. They were giving them 2, at the most 3, in the pre-electoral surveys. They ended up getting 5, and they say that they are convinced that putting so much emphasis on the leader was crucial. So why do I say, I mean, this is just to show that they have somehow contradictory discourse with their discourse and their strategy may seem contradictory, and they have been internally criticized for that by their own sympathizers, because those who believe literally on direct democracy, they cannot understand why so much emphasis is put on the leader. But the leader and his group know how effective that is in electoral terms, and so they assume the risk of being contradictory. And that's their strategy. And nowadays, a general assembly is being prepared so that the final organization of the party is voted by anybody who wants. It's going to be open primaries. And at this moment, before the end of October, which is when the General Assembly is going to take place, anybody who wants can present proposals. Okay, 2 proposals have been presented so far, one by the leader and his group, and another one by one of the other MPs in the European Parliament. There are huge differences in the 2. The one by Pablo Iglesias is a very presidentialist proposal. They know they don't want, it's not good for the party to lose control and to give too much say into the different circles. And the other proposal is the opposite. It's the opposite. They skip the figure of the Secretary General, which is present in Pablo Iglesias' proposal, and they give a lot of power to the circles. So there are already two proposals from inside the party which correspond to this contradiction that is evident. Okay, I will stop here.
Yes, and now Fernando will talk a bit more comparatively about the European elections and the results.
Well, I'll take the opportunity to quickly say something about Caesar and maybe not on the mic, it's more of a comment before while we sort out while I get my presentation. I think to imagine a Spanish Caesar would be to think of a situation if the United Left, with Guerra Unida, suddenly got Pablo Iglesias as their leader. That would be like a sort of Caesar. But they can't do that, and that's why Caesar exists, because it's really about the caste type of politics. Political parties are very, cozy creatures, and they suffer from sort of internal democracy, and that's what Podemos is really all about. It's challenging that, drawing the insights from the US about primaries. That's what Irene was talking about. But let me stop there. first time I use one of these things, really. Okay, so hello everybody. Let me start off as well by thanking the organisers for inviting me. Could I actually put this up so I don't have to crouch? That's better. To thank the organisers for inviting me here. It's a great honour and pleasure to be with you all here today to discuss what I'm going to talk about today is this presentation, which is about something that we've called the EU's direct democratic dilemma. In a way, what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to put a stopwatch on that, otherwise I talk for ages. Sort of anticipates what I think we might be discussing in the second panel, but I'll try to connect it a little bit with a project we did on the European elections, but it's really about broader models of institutional design, and the idea draws on a book that's been published by myself and two co-authors on referendums on European integration, which has just come out with CUP Press. So let's start off with what is essentially the basic, a basic dilemma. No, it's not a direct democratic dilemma. It's a sort of basic democratic dilemma that afflicts all political systems in a way. Certainly once you cross a certain threshold of individuals. And that is, how do you balance efficiency, system efficiency, with legitimacy? And as I said, this affects all forms of decision making, and it essentially relates to this idea that you have to have some degree of system efficiency while allowing for meaningful popular input, popular participation, and different systems do this in different ways. So why is this becoming a direct democratic dilemma? So let's just have some context first. We know that in the last decade or two, the EU is increasingly the object of, it's becoming more contested, more salient, and there's an increasing politicization of the EU. Some people trace it back to the petit oui on the Maastricht Treaty. Some people call it the end of the permissive consensus, but we're certainly in a new paradigm of contestation around the topic of the EU. And this is in some ways exacerbated with recent events around the financial crisis, with the onset of the financial crisis and the response of the EU. What we're finding is that the EU is increasingly playing the role of a redistributive actor. Now, we know from comparative public policy research that redistributive politics, that is taking from one group to give to another group, is the most conflictual of all policies, of all types of policies. And that is certainly the case. We've certainly witnessed that over the past few years in terms of the response to the crisis. Another characteristic of the response to the crisis is that, let's say, legitimate democratic channels to influence what is happening at the EU level are being constrained, are being purposefully limited. So that's a little bit the context. What's the problem? Well, the current configuration of electoral channels, and in particular the European parliamentary channel, offer rather weak mechanisms for popular input into what is the direction of EU integration. By this, I mean sometimes it's called the more versus less European integration dimension of politics. And the results of the EP elections, European Parliament elections, I mean, the European Parliament can have played a very strong role in, for instance, influencing, of course, the EU legislative outputs, but it can't suddenly, say, empower the European Union to act in new policy domains. It is the member states, as masters of the treaty, treaties that are empowered to do so. So the consequence of these weak channels for influencing the direction of European integration is what I think is a rise in the demand for direct democratic instruments, a bit like Pablo Iglesias in Spain, challenging the parties, but transposed to the European Union level. And the key instrument here is the referendum to directly influence the direction of European integration as a key tool. So what's the danger here? Well, the danger's rather straightforward. In a system characterized by an extremely rigid constitutional structure to effect what is the functional equivalent of a constitutional change, the EU has two unanimity laws, one at the IGC level and one in terms of any treaty change, any constitutional change in other words, has also to be ratified by all the member states according to whatever model of ratification those member states use. Now the danger here is if other states start to mimic what effectively Ireland has been doing, and to a lesser extent what Denmark has done on a number of occasions, which is to have treaty ratification referendums, then we can get a sort of DD, by DD I mean direct democratic, race to the bottom. And the UK's new referendum bloc, its 2011 European Union Act, has instituted the equivalent of a referendum bloc on future EU treaty changes, in which case the electorate of one of the most eurosceptic nations has an effective veto on the future constitutional evolution of the EU. So are there any empirically viable models for accommodating direct democracy in a multi-level polity such as the EU? The first point to note here is that the EU is not actually unique in this sense. So-called direct democratic dilemmas, that is balancing the demand for popular participation, popular input, while somehow respecting the territoriality principle, is actually quite common to federal systems. And there are essentially two ways to go about this. Two ways in which polities have somehow dealt with the direct democratic problem in a multi-level polity. One is to incorporate instruments of direct democracy at the federal level, and the classic examples here are Switzerland and Australia. The second model is to essentially ban the practice of direct democracy on federal level issues. Classic examples here are the United States and Germany. I'm just going to mention a third model, I won't go into it, but there's a third model which is sort of mixed configuration. It's a rather unstable model where referendums are used in a potentially dysfunctional way. And that would be the examples of Canada and the European Union, I would argue. So in what remains, what I'll try and do is just explore the plausibility of incorporating what is probably quite an outlandish idea, but the plausibility of incorporating direct democracy at the EU level. And that would be Model 1. Some variant of Model 1 over here. I'm going to draw on some data that was generated by a project I did on the recent European elections, which is a sort of pan-EU online voter party preferencing tool that essentially involved the coding of over 200 political parties across the EU and generated over 1 million respondents. And I'm going to focus on two items from that, from the battery of policy items that were included. One is the question of whether referendums should be used for effecting treaty change. And the second question is whether the unanimity, the member state veto point should be overcome. And I'm just going to present a couple of slides on two levels of analysis here. What I call the supply side, which essentially relates to the elites, and here I'll draw on the coded party positions for those two items of the parties we recoded, and on the demand side I'm going to look at the, it essentially relates to the citizen side, and look at some of the respondents' positions on these two items. It's not a representative survey for the demand side, so there are a few techniques that one can use to try and make that sample a bit more representative. I won't go into the technical details of that here. So, let's start off with the supply side, the elites. This graph here, this sort of rectangular area here, represents the current EP chamber. And on the x-axis, you've got the political orientation of the 8 European parliamentary groups. I've just given them their ideological orientation rather than the acronym that is used. The NI right at the end represents the non-inscrit, the non-affiliated. And what this is basically the positions of the coded political parties have been attributed to all the delegates in the current EP chamber. To give you a sort of panoramic overview of what the position would be on this question, where a green bar represents agreement in being in favour of referendums on treaty change, and the red portions of the bar represent being against or disagreeing with treaty changes. The yellow bars in the middle would be the parties that we couldn't find a position on the issue, or were somehow in the middle, so we considered those as sort of abstentions. So the key take-home point here is that these three political families there are the political parties that essentially have constructed the European Union historically. And it's probably not surprising to see that those parties generally are not in favour of having referendums on treaty change. As you can see, the red area is much bigger, with the possible exception of the Liberals. On the other hand, all those sort of new entrants that are growing in number, incidentally, growing in representation in the EP chamber, and we can see that those groups are overwhelmingly in favour of having referendums on treaty change. Perhaps not so surprising then. Let's look now, again, we're focusing on the supply side, that is the elite level. Let's just have a look at the question about overcoming the member state veto. So what we see here is, again, the constellation of parties that essentially constructed the EU. They're somewhat more favourable, perhaps with the slight exception of the EPP, the centre-right, where it's a bit more balanced between the options, but certainly the socialists and the liberals certainly aren't against the idea, quite favourably oriented towards the idea of overcoming the member state veto. On the other hand, not surprisingly, all the other new entrants are usually vehemently opposed, with the exception of the Greens here, that are pretty much in favour. This is an overview of the distributions at the aggregate level, again taking that chamber as a whole. And I guess the noteworthy point here is that there's a lot of yellow there, a lot of parties we couldn't code, but nonetheless there is somewhat of a majority on the question of the veto change, overcoming the member state veto, and much more of a majority when it comes to referendums. Let's move on to the demand side. Now we're going to look at the citizen level, that is respondents who we sampled. And here's your basic picture in terms of the citizens across 7 EU member states that were sort of semi-randomly selected to display some kind of variation across Europe. There are some big countries, small countries, Euro countries, non-Euro countries, East, West, North, South, etc. So we've got, and as I said, I had to do a few tricks to try and make this this survey a bit more representative. But the idea is just to illustrate some of the dynamics here. There's a lot of variation across the countries. I'll just hone in on this pairwise comparison here, which is not surprising. So you see that in Ireland, respondent citizens are overwhelmingly in favour of having referendums on treaty change because they're also the most used to it. They've held most referendums on EU treaty changes across all of the EU, and they don't want to let go of this. That's not surprising. All the other countries are also usually overwhelmingly in favour, with Poland perhaps the most lukewarm on the idea, although it still is higher than those that disagree. Focusing on the question of overcoming the member state veto, again there's a bit of variance. The most interesting pairwise comparison here would be between England and Germany. From the survey, it was quite surprising the degree in Germany to which the respondents were favourably disposed towards overcoming the member state veto. Whereas in England, and it was England, we separated the UK into 4 different regions. In England was the only country where there was a majority in favour of retaining, again, not surprisingly, as one of the most Eurosceptic countries. Okay, so what can we conclude from all of this in terms of models for accommodating direct democracy? Again, the first thing I really want to underscore here is the fact that the EU is not unique here. These so-called direct democratic dilemmas, how do you configure, how do you allow for popular participation in a multi-tiered polity are not uncommon in federal systems, and it's therefore not surprising that the EU is confronted with this dilemma, especially since those traditional electoral channels to influence the direction of European integration appear to be rather blunt from certain citizens' perspective. What else is there? Well, the referendum genie is very much already out of the bottle, and it's difficult to put it back in. And what we do know from comparative research on direct democracy is that once you embark on offering tools of direct democracy to the electorate, it's very difficult to put it into reverse gear. And this is somewhat reflected in terms of the sort of pent-up demand that I've pointed to in terms of the citizens, and some degree of party mobilization on the issue, with the possible exception of the 2 main parties, the EPP and the PS, the centre-right and centre-left. So instituting a referendum is one known viable model. By that I mean a referendum at the highest level, at the federal level, or at the, in our case, the EU level, is one viable model for accommodating those inevitable pressures that exist in most multi-tiered polities. The other model, of course, is to ban the practice of direct democracy on what are effectively federal level issues. If the EU were to embark on such a DD model, and I'm not saying this is the most plausible model out of, in the book we looked at 5 distinct models for accommodating direct democracy, and this is not the most plausible, but it's probably one of the most, say, directly legitimate models in terms of allowing for popular input into the process. But if you are going to pursue or institute some kind of DD model, then it would only make sense to do so if the unanimity constraint were overcome. To the extent that you achieve such a model, you'd be closer to having instituted a pan-EU referendum model. The only proviso here, of course, is the obvious one, that in order to do that, you have to overcome the veto in the first place. Look, I think I'll stop there and leave the rest for discussion.
Thank you very much, Fernando.
One question to Irene. Again, thank you very much for the very informative sort of charts and analysis. Of course, the topic of your presentation was a comparison of Syriza with Podemos, but obviously, as you are very well aware of, there is another new political party that shares other types of characteristics with Podemos here, Topotami. We have Nicolas Yatromanolakis from Potami. Perhaps we'll... Pardon? The river, yes. Podemos, we can. If we keep Podemos, keep the Potami, no? Okay. by analogy. So I would like you, have you carried out research on that comparison, or do you have some sort of understanding or something that you would like to share with us?
No, but yesterday I was talking to George Paulatos about it in the... Yeah, yesterday I was talking to Mr. Paulatos about Podemos in the taxi, and he was telling me that... No, it was a different conversation, sorry. I'm mixing it up, just so that you don't blame him for anything. No, it was with another friend. Anyway, and this comparison immediately came to his mind. But for what you're saying, this denial of ideology makes Podemos a lot more similar to Potami. And in that sense, probably it's interesting to make a comparison of these new ways of making politics that are being implemented by these new parties, but it wouldn't be at all comparable in terms of the content of its proposals. In that sense, the electoral program of Podemos is, for the European elections, it's really identical or very similar to that of Syriza. So it's the game, this combination that is quite original. How can you combine a program that is similar to the program of a clearly leftist party with both this open, it's not an open denial of ideology. I mean, they deny ideology in very specific interviews when you ask them, are you leftist or not? It's not that they criticize the left openly, they just don't mention it. I mean, it's their strategy not to focus too much on ideology. But the content of their program is similar to a program of the left. And probably the use of media is also comparable to that of Potami.
In what way?
How much they rely on the media, probably. I mean, I don't know so much about Potami, so I don't dare to say much. I know many of them come from the media world, so I assume they have a good command and that they rely a lot on that. In the case of Podemos, it's clear, but what is also interesting is that they not only used social media. I mean, of course, they also use that, but then that explains somehow why they still get more support from well-educated groups and from students, and slightly more support, not that much. And that is changing. From the elections until now, that is disappearing. But they rely really very much on television. very, very much.
Just a small, when I listened to you, I thought it was really a lot of parallels with Movimiento Cinque Stelle, Berlin, non-ideological, transparency, direct democracy, media-based, at the same time leader oriented. So it would be really interesting comparison.
I guess they must differ in the populism, the extent of which they use populism as a main underlying strategy, especially when you make the comparison. Just to abuse my role as a chair, I think also that there is a clear distinction here to be made between Cinque Stelle and Podemos in terms of what extent they can be considered as clear populist political
But they are
forces.
allowed to be populist. The Berlin, they say, we don't want that, and that's a good thing to be populist.
Yes.
Just to refer back to the comparison between Podemos and Potami, and actually I'll speak with my experience. I was a campaign manager for the Potami, so I was actually following Podemos very, very closely in terms of the way they organize themselves. We pretty much launched at the same time, and in terms of our structure and also the rejection, as you said, of the let's say of the traditional axis of left and right, we are very similar to that. Also, you know, we've used a similar structure with the circles that Podemos has, and there's certain similarities there. And also, we have been using media and social media to a great extent to drive our message. I would say in that respect, yes, they are very. I would say that. Potami was actually very frequently compared to Cinque Stelle, and I was saying that, you know, if you wanted to compare to something else because you need to have a point of reference, I would say it would be more accurate to compare us to Podemos rather than Cinque Stelle, because Cinque Stelle started in a different way. It was a bit more grassroots. Podemos was also, we are not. Syriza is not also, so it's very interesting that Syriza is actually just a shift of like an old guard of a party to a different party, you know. That's my personal opinion. But then Cinque Stelle is very anti-European and all that in terms of ideology. We are very pro-European. Our messaging is very different. So, but I would say that yes, I agree with you that program-wise, we're not there for sure. They're closer to Syriza, but they're closer to Syriza. But in terms of this new concept, like a new breed of parties that are kind of like viewing politics more in a functional way, in a pragmatic way, rather than on an ideological basis, yes, I would say that actually we are much closer to Podemos than Syriza.
Yes.
I think it's to say here the discussion about comparing different parties. I think you made some important comments, but in passing, and I would like to ask not so much comparing parties, but compare some fundamental differences about what society needs. So you mentioned caste versus ideology, or at some point, and then you mentioned that there are contradictions. So it seems from this discussion and comparing different parties that on one hand, society needs something new. And something new, maybe someone gets you on a popular television program trying to become popular. That may get you a certain way, but that never solves the problem. So this is the meteoric rise and meteoric fall. And on the other hand, you have this discussion that ideology, traditional ideologies, do not seem to solve any problem anymore, because ideologies exist. So can you comment on these parties you are comparing? How do you see them going in the direction of politics and get people and change the old with the new, versus having a new program which is non-ideological, as you correctly said?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things they've been criticized for. They are not proposing specific solutions yet. So they are trying to define their image.
Podemos has the same problem, like.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I mean, the party is being constituted these days. It's as recent as that. I mean, they presented the list to the European elections, but it's now, it's on the, I don't remember the date, what is it, on the 20th of October, that the General Assembly is going to be, to take place. So, I mean, we are talking about something that is, it is a party, but it's not yet a party. I mean, there are many, many important decisions that need to be taken. In the program they presented for the European elections, there were no specific solutions, proposals. No, I mean, anybody will agree with the electoral program, I think, in a way.
Can I also ask another question for Adrienne, very quickly?
Yes.
When you mentioned that, Adrienne, you mentioned that the proposal by the European Parliament was very ingenious to suggest that they would suggest the President of the Commission. Yes. Now, if the Council had come back and made a counter proposal for someone who could win a majority of the European Parliament, because Mr. Juncker was the winning party, but he did not have a majority. So they come back, they propose someone else, and that person wins majority. Would this be a coup in your opinion, or would this be more democracy? Because we left it open, so I like what happened, but it's not fully parliamentarization. You have someone who does not have necessarily majority.
Well, in theory, of course, the European Council could have come up with a proposal of a candidate. But all those who were potentially interested had a lot to give up, like being prime minister somewhere, for an uncertain situation in the parliament of getting a majority. So no attractive kind of candidates came up and were candidates. Because the parliament moved so forcefully in saying it has to be the one who has the majority in the elections. So it was the dynamics of the game, really. But you're right that theoretically the council could have, of course, come up with a proposal.
But also it's an approach through which you may always have someone whose party gets 33% being the commissioner, while someone else could get coalition majority.
Yes.
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 Okay. Thinking of Professor Di Maduro's work on political cultural parties in Southern Europe in the past, I was wondering whether Podemos and Syriza reflect a current of recurring populism in Southern Europe. Is it like a revenge of the 80s, this call for direct participation, or is it just the crisis that accelerated this surge of new populism? Is it something pre-existing that found a slot in the crisis in order to surge, or is it something that pre-existed, it's always there, and it was something that would happen anyway, given the context of Southern European politics and this dualism between this modernization and populist culture? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it in those terms, but I mean, this division between Podemos and what they call the caste is exactly this division between this modernizing and underdog culture that Professor Diamandouros talks about. So it's interesting to think about it in those terms. In the case of Greece, maybe because I've always read Professor Diamandouros' text referring to Greece, I see it very clearly, and it's something that is not recent, on the contrary. In the case of Spain, I would say it's a product of the crisis. I don't think there was an underlying populist culture until now. It's totally new. I mean, that would be my guess. I would need to think more about it, but my first answer would be it's the result of the crisis.
Thank you. Just a few comments, if I may. I'll start with what Irene just said. I think it's important to place this whole discussion in the context. In a context, and I think the context is extremely important, we should not lose sight of, is the whole issue of crisis, austerity, and all the dilemma that it produces. In other words, are the phenomena we're looking at really in political development entirely independent of the broader socioeconomic picture? And I think the answer is not. So we've got to take that into account when we actually kind of decide or try to interpret events. And I think the crisis is in a deep background, I think, what defines the context. Second, very quickly, and I'll have a few comments for Stavros. Political scientists are very acutely aware of the difference between pluralities and majorities. And I think what was being discussed in the European Parliament was the classical issue of the party that has earned or received the largest number of votes, not a clear majority. Therefore, there was legitimation in the argument that the party that comes out with the largest, the candidate representing the party with the largest number of votes, has a legitimate reason to stand. I think this is what legitimated the Juncker situation, irrespective of the fact that it could be a negative majority, which is much more difficult to put together. Now, my three comments. The first one I'd like to address to Adrienne. I'm very happy that you actually kind of focused on this issue of the emerging new EU architecture, because I think that the institutional design, as the organizers called it, because I think the issue of governance is really lurking in a major way behind what's going on right now. And my question to you is, I'm having difficulty interpreting your intentions. You have a question mark at the end of your title. You spoke more assertively as if you seem to believe that we are, in fact, in a new phase. We have shifted almost paradigms. So my question is, are you looking at something that you see as a very strong tendency towards solidification, or are you describing something which is a trend that might be moving in a different direction? Am I clear? All right. In terms of Podemos and Otami, I'd like to draw, Mr. Yakomalakis, out my own sense, but obviously you are the expert, I'm not, is that when it comes to raising the issue of populism, Otami is decisively not populist.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, therefore that's a very important distinction there that needs to be borne in mind. And finally, in terms of Fernando, I very much liked what you presented. My problem is twofold. I have great difficulty, not with your particular presentation, but generally with an argument that epistemologically is grounded on an assumption that projects directly from the conceptual model of the nation state onto the EU. The EU, as far as I'm concerned, is not a nation state, is not designed to operate as a nation state, is not meant to be a nation state, even of a federal type. Therefore, what I'm asking you to comment on is how easy is it to be able to make that kind of a leap and say, well, because they have it in Australia and in Germany, etc., it is possible to imagine something, an entity that is deliberately not conceived of as a kind of a nation state writ large, not even a federal state writ large at this point. So for me, that's very important because when we try to transfer patterns, knowledge of the past, and make projections about the future, are we talking about how easy is it to be able to borrow concepts on that type? I have difficulty with that because I find that let's take an example. I'm very impressed by your statistics. What I know historically about Germany and the German state is that Germans have an abhorrence of referenda. For historical reasons we need not go into, okay. And therefore they're extremely unlikely to move in the direction of, in fact, adopting a referendum as a mechanism of democracy. Then my last comment, which is to everybody, and it is of course controversial. If we're talking openly about a paradigm shift from a representative democracy to direct democracy, then we've got to factor in the way in which referenda will operate. again, my own experience, having looked at less Australia, but certainly Switzerland, is that the referendum is an extraordinarily delicate and an extraordinarily potentially dangerous instrument of policy. Dangerous in what sense? Think of how close Felipe González came to losing it over the NATO referendum. Potentially dangerous in the sense that what becomes extraordinarily difficult in any referendum is exactly how you phrase the particular question you will get out of. Okay? And then the referendum is an easier instrument for black and white issues. It's an extraordinarily difficult instrument when it comes to asking very difficult questions. When the Spaniards again were asked, or were voting on the European elections, there was something that I saw in El País. Somebody who was asked, he said, yes, I voted yes. I cannot read the treaty. I don't know what the treaty says, but Europe is good for us. Okay. So if it's black and white, it's easy. If it is constitutional, kind of monarchy versus republic, it's easy. When you're talking about a treaty of 700 pages or anything that's extraordinarily complex, particularly the way the EU presents, the EU legal services construct the documents that people are supposed to understand and vote on, the referendum becomes a potential trap. So I'm concerned politically, not only as a political scientist, but also as a citizen, about the potential dangers lurking in a referendum, which does not mean that I take a position against forms of direct democracy, but I'd like to draw you out of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Carlos Rosa.
Thank you very much. And, I have a question for Adrienne and also another one for Fernando, but let me first say that an observation on Podemos, although I don't think we should make of the center of this discussion the comparison between the Greek and the Spanish case, but I think Podemos has got some kind of inheritance, something which is very populistic and collective in Spain, which is the anarchist movement. And there is a coincidence, I don't know whether you agree with that, Irene, that whilst the leadership has got some kind of Leninist manners and attitudes, they perceive themselves as the avant-garde of the movement. They benefit very much of a kind of spontaneous organization, what brings very much into the tradition of self-organization and that in Spain in the 30s with the anarchist movement. And several of the people who we can see around the circles in Canarias are very much in line with this tradition of acrats and anarchists and so on. I don't know whether you agree with me or not on that point, but I think it's important to take into account this reference, political cultural reference. And my two questions, one for Adrienne is, I wonder what I could push a little bit more elaborating the perspective of formalization, because I agree with you that it seems that we are in that track of parliamentarization, but I wonder if we could speculate, and I know that you don't like speculating, on which model of parliamentarization we are going to have in the future, because it seems to me they are now in a consensual, highly consensual model, because the agreement between socialists and Christian Democrats is always required. Right? But I wonder at some point there may be the temptation to steer the model through the formal rules to a more majoritarian or adversarial model, which, for instance, you could say that the winner of the elections will be the one who nominates the President of the Commission. It may look unlikely, but you take into account the kind of dominance, or not dominance, majority of Christian Democrats in the last decade. This could be I think that is, I don't know whether you could say something, whether this switch between consensual parliamentarism towards majoritarian parliamentarism is likely. And then for Fernando, I have a reflection that goes very much in the line of what those just said, which institutions are always embedded in the setting, and that's the case of referendums. And the specific balance that democracy has between representative democracy and direct democracy is always checked out by a number of other institutional elements. This reasoning, which related to the European Union, and specifically specifically to the case that you put forward, the case you put forward is on treaty reform. I was very surprised that you put forward a case on referendums on specific legislation, which was proposed many years ago, for instance, by Philip Schmidt. It would be a very good test of democracy, whether European citizens agree, for instance, with a proposal of a regulation regarding, animal welfare or something like that. It would be a nice arena to test referendums in the way it's done in Switzerland, by the way, which is always the model that is behind when we're speaking about referendums. But if we refer to treaty reform, what we have here is institutional setting in which I will call attention at least to the elements, which are two institutional elements here. One is the unanimity rule, and the unanimity rule means that taking into consideration what I'm going to say about, I wouldn't say black and white, but I say in a referendum you have a question, but what is important to know is what is the question that the voters have in mind when they are responding, because voters respond to different questions. Do you like this treaty? And they respond, I don't like the government. Do you like this treaty? I don't like this policy. Well, I disagree with the current one. But I'm very upset because the Spanish team lost again. So the response that is in the mind of the elector can never be sure that we are able to. But I don't think that's the real problem. The real problem is that this process, this instrument, this institution, is embedded within a unanimity rule. A unanimity rule means that the cost of the decisions are externalized all through the European Union. If you vote no, theoretically, the costs are assumed by all the European Union, even though you are part of the deal, that is a small part of the Union. Because of that, some people are arguing that what you need to have is a kind of democracy, some kind of concurrent majority. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense to making the absolute case for direct democracy in treaty reforms. If you take it nationally, you take it at the level of European Union, you have a big dilemma there, which is how you compose the majority that could be considered the majority of a demos of a European demos. There are theoretical and practical questions behind that. That means does it mean that you have 50% of the European citizens voting in favor of a treaty, you can overcome, for instance, the opinion of voters of a small country like, say, Cyprus or Malta, voting in a different direction? Is that legitimate from a certain point of view? So this kind of proposal seems to me highly problematic because, again, institutions have to be contemplated in a embeddedness of a number of other institutions. And one observation, it's not strange for me that in the data you saw on the supply side, it seems to me, and I was just thinking by memory, but there is a correlation between support for referendums among political parties and the size they have in the European Parliament. So the two biggest parties are not in favor of referendum, Socialists and Christian Democrats, and the smaller the groups are, more or less, the bigger the support for referendums. And I think that says something for the smaller groups. Referendums is a very good instrument to shake up the political landscape and to get new political opportunities. Not that I wouldn't take as a kind of genuine. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to Boris?
Can I just very quickly clarify the black and white issue? What I meant simply in my mind is that the referendum is much more amenable to high clarity. Are you in favor of NATO or against NATO? Are you in favor of having a monarchy or a republic? And conversely, once you get into complex policy issues and options, then the referendum, I think, becomes a problematic instrument for democracy. That's all I meant.
Yes.
A few reactions. First of all, my intentions in a way is analyzing developments which are ongoing. I don't have any preferences for a particular direction, one or the other. And I do think that you indeed can analyze such trends quite clearly. But I would like to link that to what Fernando said. What if we would move to a more adversarial, majoritarian system in the course of politicization of a commission political program supported by the majority in parliament? I actually think that could be rather dangerous, given the diversity of Europe, the diversity of preferences, 25 member states. And I think keeping the balance between this diversity of preferences was actually a big virtue of the Commission in the last years. And if the Commission would become very politicized, with one program, majoritarian program, outvoting, all the rest, I think that could be dynamite for the European Union. One point, and I totally agree with you as well, that you can't draw solutions, you can't use solutions from the nation state to the European level, because the governance model is too complex. It's multi-level, such diversity of preferences, diversity of institutional traditions, and linking that to what Fernando said, I think if you would have referenda over issues, on particular issues, in all, subunits of the EU, on small issues, you would have blockage all the time, constantly, these external costs, constantly. And then, of course, then the question indeed, but that was already said, if you talk about the referendum at the EU level, pro-treaty, no, again, you have to hide the complexity of the questions, which is, and makes it very difficult.
Okay, so we're getting a common thread here of arguments. Disclaimer first. I presented a model. There were actually 5 models in the book, and the choice of model was one that would stimulate discussions. It's not that I'm necessarily in favour, I'm certainly not in favour of referendums at the EU level unless they're instituted in a particular way. So you can't willy-nilly transpose institutions, as you mentioned, from political culture X to a different paradigm. But let me go over some of the comments. So what Professor Diamandouros relates to is what we call the N=1 problem for the European Union. And I actually had a different slide where I started off, bringing out what is my position on this ontological question about the EU. I take the opposite picture, which is that I think there's a lot to learn from looking at how other political systems deal with politics. In other words, I think there's a danger in emphasizing uniqueness. So if you just emphasize uniqueness, you get to a relativist position where nothing can be said. Now, the United States is extremely, it's very unique as a political system. Doesn't mean we can't compare it to, say, Switzerland, another very unique system. I, of course, understand that the EU is not a nation state, and it's not going to become a nation state. But the dynamics you know very well, all of us here, take a dynamic like creeping competence. We know this happens. Any constitutional lawyer who has studied the evolution of the United States will find similarities in the constitutional creeping competences, anyone who studied Switzerland. Likewise, if you want to look at the Eurozone right now, you can highlight the deficiencies of the EU regime precisely by comparing it to other systems, particularly federal systems. Incidentally, a very good federal system to compare the problems with the current Eurozone crisis would be the Swiss federal banking system, where the bank is owned by the constituent units, a little bit like the EU version. And if you're dealing with regulatory policy, then again we compare the EU's internal market. The EU's been able to expand its competencies because it's used something like the interstate commerce clause that exists in the United States. So my point is that I think there's a lot to be learned from comparison. And incidentally, when you speak about the problems with direct democracy, you're implicitly using examples from the nation state. For example, and this is the arguments against direct democracy, they're well known. It's essentially relates to what is called the citizen competence argument, that citizens aren't equipped to deal with the complexities of the issues. That's an empirical question. There is evidence to the contrary, certainly in places where, of course, direct democracy is instituted. In fact, there's the other argument against that, and not on one side or the other, is that referendums serve as kind of events to politicize an issue, so that debates are had. And anyone who's followed the recent debate in Scotland a few weeks ago will see the effect, the mobilization effect of having a referendum. Doesn't mean it's a good idea or a bad idea, but there are various sides to this argument. Carlos's point on the direct democracy on certain policy issues, etc. We've got to recognise one thing which I, again, didn't mention, but that is the implementation, which is unique across the world, of something like, I'll call it something almost equivalent to a federal bottom-up initiative, which is the European Citizens Initiative. Now, there are a host of problems there, and if you were to look at some of the proposals that are coming out of the Citizens Initiative, a lot of them have they're almost like, grassroots, let's have more direct democracy. So I'd argue that there is a trend. It's a very weak form, it's an agenda setting. I mean, if it were the Swiss equivalent, it would lead to a referendum once you got the requisite signatures. And you can see that the Commission is already backtracking on it. It doesn't like these initiatives. But we are getting some. And my point was to say, well, how did other federal systems deal with this problem? The United States had a similar problem. I think it was Iowa, I can't remember it, but tried to have the equivalent of an Irish or UK referendum, which the Supreme Court had to declare inconstitutional in the 1920s. It was on an amendment, one of the few amendments they've had in the US on, I think, prohibiting alcohol in the 1920s. So that problem, dealing with sort of extraterritorial referendums when Ireland or the UK has them on something that have had to be dealt with in other cases. Incidentally, I didn't go into it, but Canada has instituted, which many people don't know, there's been a mimetic effect. I think Ontario first instituted a constituent unit referendum, mandatory referendum on any constitutional change that has been copied by other constituent units, the other provinces. That's an interesting dynamic. It's something that could happen in the medium term in the in the European Union. The other point was the question of multidimensionality versus what is essentially unidimensionality. We know that if a question encompasses many issues, many complex issues, you're dealing with a multidimensional phenomenon, and it's very hard to put that into, in fact, it's mathematically impossible to put that into a binary yes-no vote. Hence your policy initiatives. Well, the only real policy initiative, well, we've had a few, but it would be enlargement. There has been an enlargement referendum. Unfortunately, it was an extraterritorial type that took place in France in 1972. This would be a single issue. Do we expand the EU? Yes or no, perhaps, this kind of issue. To wrap up, we actually don't think this is the most plausible model. You just can't transplant these institutions as I'm trying to argue. But the EU will have to deal with this problem. Take Scotland or Catalonia, or you've got bottom-up dynamics, referendums that are having an extraterritorial impact. How do you negotiate? That's the issue. Of course, there are various models to do that, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the most plausible. I don't think it is even the most plausible. But there is some scope to perhaps configure systems. We explore various models in the book to configure systems that would allow citizens maybe some form of direct input, which would, incidentally, probably be much more have much more of an impact than, say, the European elections, where, I mean, these are generally apathetic affairs. Referendum, just to posit the counterfactual, I'm sure would generate a high turnout, but you could only do this in the context of a non-unanimity. Although we do envisage another model, which is to say the EU has a secession clause. You can leave the EU. So you could reject in a referendum, but you've got to know the full consequences. That if you want to take this to its logical conclusion, then perhaps, that's in fact what Cameron is doing, then the route is to leave. So that's another way. But I would be against a referendum in the context of unanimity.
Very own reflection from Professor Closa, just and then
I just wanted to expand the idea of referendums as institutions have to be embedded, and it's not only the unanimity rule, it's also what is around the design of referendums, who is calling the referendum, and what the political effects of a referendum are. Let me put an example. The French president has called referendums on the European Union treaties 3 times, including the one, the treaty accession of the United Kingdom. And the puzzling thing is that there is no political responsibility by treaties that have been negotiated by the French executive. So you can put a treaty to the public, get it rejected, eventually hasn't got political effects. We know that in the case of Chirac, he fired, I think, was Juppé, the prime minister in that time. But you take also the case of Holland, the Netherlands in 2005, there were no consequences because the citizens related a treaty that the government negotiated, and so on and so forth. The only case in which you can have this kind of functionality was Luxembourg, in which I think was Juncker, if I'm not mistaken, say that his fate as a government was related to the fate of the referendum. And that's the kind of institutional elements that transform the way in which the citizens might interpret what is the referendum about. It's not a free choice, a free decision hasn't got any kind of cost, has got a political element. And that has to be constructed with other kind of institutions, not only unanimity rule, it's also what are the effects on the government which is calling the referendum, if it is a government calling the referendum, and so on and so forth. So the reflection has to be much more complex than just merely accepting that there is a demand for referendums, of course, for their participation. But there are institutions that have to be embedded in these decisions.
unless there is any other very painful reaction, yes.
A very short comment, if I may.
Very short, yeah.
I will emphatically agree with you on the absolute necessity of being comparative. So I was not, if I gave the impression of being an advocate of uniqueness, far be it from me to do that. Okay, to be absolutely clear. And therefore, my question, my concern was really with the pitfalls of potentially moving down to one particular type of direct democracy, which is referendum, other than through other instruments. But I think we've entered the era of there's a clamoring for more direct participation. How it's done is a different story, but I want to just make sure that I don't give the impression that I'm in fact arguing for uniqueness, because I would go against everything I believe in.
Okay, and a very quick question for Adrienne. Just to link today's discussion with one of the conclusions we reached last year. So that conclusion was that the reason of oxymoron, we need more Europe, but because of Europhobia, euroscepticism, etc., the new European Parliament is not gonna, not gonna be in a position to pay or to help us create more Europe. So the question would be, do you see this process of parliamentarization, especially the way the President of the Commission was elected this year, as how do you link it with the crisis? Is it something that was designed before the crisis, and then the crisis did not manage to curb it, to put an end, to stop it? Or is it quite the opposite, something which, stems from the crisis, it's the output of the crisis?
Just a quick answer. I think this process has been ongoing for decades, actually. And the crisis now, of course, created a context in which the political players are aware of being under attack, under critique by anti-European parties, and therefore, in a sense, can move together in order to protect institutions that make them stronger. but as an institutional vested interest of particularly the Parliament's interest. It has been ongoing over a long period of time.
So I think it's a good idea to stop here because the lunch break is anyway only 1 hour. So thank you very, very much for your active participation. And lunch is served at the same place as the breakfast. And see you all at 1 o'clock.
Oh, good.